All right. Hello, good morning. Thanks for being here today. So I think a lot of you know me, Marta Dapena-Baron. I'm Managing Director at Big Picture Partners, and I'm here today to talk to you about storytelling and strategy. Now, storytelling in marketing has become a very popular topic. So people are constantly talking about how we need to tell stories to customers. But I want to make the point that the same techniques that you use to engage and inform customers, you need to use those same techniques to engage, inform, and motivate internal audiences. So think about your strategic plan really as a mirror of your customer brand story. All right, so with that, let me start. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Spain, and I grew up in the 1970s, which obviously makes me ancient now. And I grew up just after the Civil War. Turns out both of my grandparents fought in the Civil War, grandfathers. One of my grandfathers was a train conductor, and he hid provision trains from bomb raids during the war. And the other one ended up fighting for the resistance and ended up in a concentration camp, actually not far away from where I grew up, but of course, many years before I ever existed. And so I learned lots of stories about the war where my grandparents were heroes. Not sure whether that was true. And then as I became a little bit older, I love stories, and I told myself stories about myself, what I could do in the future. And I imagine myself leaving Spain and moving to another continent and getting a scholarship and going to college in the US and eventually becoming a diplomat and traveling the world. Well, of course, not that entire story became true, but I did leave. And I think it's because of story that I am here where I am today, doing the things I do today. So stories are really important to humans, and stories are uniquely human. It's only humans, it's the only species that tells stories, that craves stories, that crafts stories. We use stories to simplify complex concepts. So we think of stories as sense-making tools. And imagine how you teach children vocabulary. We don't just give children a bunch of words and ask them to remember them in a list. We craft stories. We connect those words into narratives. So stories help us remember important concepts. And as I mentioned for myself, stories can help people narrate the future. And that role of stories is really important for marketers because marketers need to cause positive change in customers. And it's critical that you get customers to imagine the future. In fact, if you love stories, marketing is a great career choice, right? Think about the skills that you need as a marketer. So we ask questions and we gather category and customer insights, right? And then it's not enough to have data and to do analysis. You need to get that data and analysis to become kind of a cogent set of facts that fit into a brand strategy story, right? And brand strategy stories, like, as I mentioned before, they need to engage your audiences. We also craft value propositions. Those are compelling calls to action that need to utilize emotion to motivate customers to want to know more and want to engage with the brand. And then there's an operational side to what we do in marketing as well. So we design customer experiences. We think about all the touch points that need to motivate customers to become aware of something, to want to know more, to want to seek answers, and ultimately to engage with brands. So marketing engages both the left side and the right side of our brains. It requires that you're comfortable with facts and data and analysis, but also, of course, that you're comfortable with persuasion and engagement techniques. And storytelling and the techniques of storytelling, therefore, are really critical here. So you love stories, you decide to become a marketer, yay, you go to work, but then, of course, you are faced with your first, big strategic plan that you have to develop. And this is where I think things kind of fall apart. So think about how a strategy, just a normal strategic plan, is different from a story. So strategies are normally arranged in a list of topics. I could like pull up a strategic plan and there it is. I could arrange those topics alphabetically, geographically, in a time series. But stories have narrative themes. They have beginnings, exciting middles, and resolving ends, right? So strategies have a bunch of facts and figures. Stories have metaphors, they have images, they're graphic. Strategies are rational and are monotonous, whereas stories are emotional. They engage us at just a different level. Strategies are general. They talk about buyers and sellers and macro trends. Well, stories are specific and personal, and for that reason, they resonate. And then, of course, strategies are unsensational, whereas stories are dramatic, right? So think about it. How do you make your strategic plan engaging? How do you make it persuasive? How can you make it motivating? And how can you make it memorable? And what happens if you don't, right? What happens if your plan is none of those things? People will just put it away, put it in a drawer, forget about it, go back to work. Is that so bad? Turns out it is bad. So think about it. You develop a plan, you engage your entire team, you spend weeks working on it, and then nobody uses it. What a waste. Alternatively, people just go to work, they have no plan, or maybe because your plan wasn't very good. And so the team does okay. I mean, people know what to do for their work. They go to work, they get their job done. The problem with this, of course, is that great execution without strategy leads to erratic performance, right? We don't have a true north. We don't know what to follow. And the other thing is that even when we do well without a plan, we don't know what to replicate. And when things don't go so well, we don't know what to fail in order to start to get to do things better. And so what happens in organizations that really lack a skill of strategic planning is that when new management comes in, everything is thrown out the window and people start over again. So it's not great. Now, of course, as you think about marketers, people that you know who are successful marketers, they're all great storytellers, right? They're people who stand up on a stage and tell great stories and motivate others to follow them. You may not necessarily admire everybody on this page, but I think you would agree they're pretty good storytellers. And if you go back to the origins of marketing, and I'm going to go back to the 1960s, at that time, David Ogilvy, who Time magazine called the most sought after wizard in advertising, came up with iconic campaigns like this one for Dove. And I hope you'll notice that he used storytelling techniques here. And let me read. Darling, I'm having the most extraordinary experience. I'm head over heels in Dove. No, darling, Dove, D, like in delicious. I told you, sweet, I'm in the tub, taking a bath, a Dove bath, my very first. And what a positively gorgeous time I'm having. It's just as if I never really bathed before. No, dear, it isn't soap. Soap was never like this, so wickedly creamy. That man on TV said that Dove is 1/4 cleansing cream, that it creams my skin while I bathe. And now I really believe him. And you know how soap leaves your skin so dry? That nasty stretch feeling? Well, Dove makes me feel all velvet and silk, all soft and smooth, just the most pampered, most spoiled, girliest girl in the world. Darling, I'm purring. And just think, darling, tomorrow night I can do it again. Wow. And I actually looked at Mad Men, one of my favorite shows, because, of course, it talks about advertising. And in Mad Men, there's a very famous scene where Don Draper talks about what was actually a real campaign in the 1960s, that for the Kodak carousel, their slide projector. And this is what Don Draper, played by John Hamm, says. This device isn't a spaceship. It's a time machine. It takes us to a place where we ache to go again. It's not called a wheel, it's called the carousel. It lets us travel the way a child travels, round and around, back home again, to a place where we know we're loved. So storytelling was really in the 60s, right? And after all, David Ogilvy said, you cannot bore people into buying your product. You can only interest them in buying it. Now, fast forward to today, the role of storytelling is perhaps more important than ever. What we have going on today is an incredible proliferation of brands and products. And so people are really unable to make good choices. There is this phenomenon called the paradox of choice, coined by Barry Schwartz at Swarthmore. And he talks about how when faced with many similar options, humans are unable to make choices and are actually made unhappy by the ability to choose. And just think of yourself walking into a Walmart and trying to buy a product in virtually any category. It's an experience I really try to avoid. So there's this really famous study where they had jam, and they stocked a shelf with 26 kinds of jams. And in a different store, they stocked the shelf with just 6 kinds of jams. They found, of course, that with more products, there was more attention. So more customers came to look at the shelf with the many more products and many more kinds of jams. But just 3% of shoppers actually purchased. Whereas with the shelf with the 6 kinds of jams, 30% of shoppers purchase. So fewer choices, 10 time increase in shopping. So today we want our brand not only to engage and create awareness, you really need your brand to become a customer choice unit, to stand out from the rest. And storytelling, of course, is critical to be able to do that. So let me tell you a little bit about storytelling and the people who study storytelling. So Aristotle, I guess, is our first student of storytelling, and he studied both tragedies and comedies. He was the very first one to say that stories have structure. They have beginnings, middles, and end, and they engage in drama. So there's a rising of emotion as you go through the story. He also talked about the elements of stories. He talked about stories needing to have characters, plot, thought, and then these sort of contextual things, diction, music, and spectacle. After all, you probably relate to this. You probably have never heard a great story about people who started out being really happy. They won the lottery, so they became even happier. And then great things happened to them after that, and they were happier at the end, right? So no great stories about happy people who become happier. So you need some drama, you need some vicissitude to occur. Now, Gustav Freytag in the 1860s talked about story structure as not just having three parts, but having actually 7. So he said, story starts with an exposition, background information of the plot that includes characters and setting. Then there is an initial incident. So this is the very first conflict that happens in the plot. And then there is an increase in emotion with rise in action. And generally in the part of rise in action, you have 3 major events that add suspense or tension to the plot. Then there's finally a climax, the most suspenseful part of the plot, the turning point where for the protagonist. And then there is falling action. So falling action is 3 events or so that unravel the conflict between the protagonist and generally an antagonist, of course. Then there's a resolution where the conflict is sort of resolved and we discover what happens to the protagonist. And finally, there's a really important part, the denouement or the tying of loose ends. So 7 parts, not just 3 parts to a story. Now, fast forward to the 1950s, and we look at Joseph Campbell, who was an anthropologist and really, really famous for studying myths. And he said that stories have 3 acts. So he really borrowed from Aristotle here. But he added that in stories, there was an ordinary world and there was a special world, an extraordinary world. And he talked about stories having 12 parts within those 3 acts. So a hero is in an ordinary world. He doesn't know, or she doesn't know they're a hero yet. They hear a call to adventure, but at first refuse it. And importantly, they meet a mentor. They meet someone who guides them into that extraordinary world. So they cross the threshold there. They have some adventures. They meet allies and enemies. They go into the innermost cave. They have some sort of big ordeal. And they, of course, succeed. go back to the ordinary world, but importantly, they do so transformed. And it is this idea of a journey that we've really adopted in marketing. And in marketing, of course, we have a hero, and it is not the brand. The hero is, of course, the customer. And we have the brand as a mentor. So this idea of the hero's journey is really alive and well in marketing with customer journey mapping, which we'll take a look at in a moment. Really, really funny and interesting. If you kind of go forward from Joseph Campbell, you find Kurt Vonnegut. And Kurt Vonnegut was at the University of Chicago. In fact, his master thesis topic on stories was rejected, but nonetheless, he became very famous as a writer and also as a student of story. So he said that there are story archetypes, and he had 8, but 4 main types. One of them is man in a hole. So he said stories often follow this structure where there is a character who gets in trouble, so then, kind of goes down, has some ill fortune, but then, gets out of the hole and everything's fine. There is a boy meets girl. So boy meets girl, so things like, are great, but then the boy loses the girl, so some ill fortune there. Finally, they get back together and everything's great. Then there's a story of Cinderella, right? So you wake up in a castle, you have a terrible stepmom, things are miserable, your sisters yell at you, things are really, really bad. But then one day you meet, a wizard or a fairy godmother who brings you great fortune. And everything's fantastic. So suddenly you have this big rise, but unfortunately then the clock strikes midnight and you lose it all, and things go back to their miserable beginning. But suddenly, the glass shoe fits and everything's great forever, ever again. And then probably my favorite story archetype, that of Kafka. So you wake up in the morning, you've been turned into a terrible bug. Your family goes into, a tizzy. And they start actually trying to help you get out of your terrible state, but they cannot. So your entire family becomes impoverished. Everybody's miserable. Then you get sick and you die. That's not a very hopeful story, but nonetheless, Kafka sold lots of books, so must not be so bad. So 4 main story archetypes. And I love these because when I've actually taken a look at strategies and brands, we have found that there are 4 types of strategies as well, 4 strategy archetypes. After all, there are only 2 ways to grow a brand. You can grow a brand by getting new customers, or you can grow a brand by working with existing customers. And when we looked at the business category, kind of the competitive field, also there are kind of 2 ways to grow a brand. You can grow a brand by expanding the category. If you are a category leader, that is by far the best way to go. Or you can grow a brand if you're not the category leader at the expense of somebody else in the category. And so that gives you those 4 strategies. Category development, you're growing a category, you come up with a new business model, and you bring new customers into it. Then there's brand expansion. This is a strategy for category leaders who have amassed a reasonable number of loyal customers, and then it becomes most efficient by working with them and getting them to use the brand in more valuable ways. Then you have brand commitment, where there again you have some retained customers, but they're using you as part of a set of brands within the category, so you really need to get them to be more committed. And then there's brand switching. And this is a strategy for brands that come into a business category, but they don't have the kind of breakthrough innovation that would motivate customers to think about their business model in a totally different way. They cannot redraw category lines. So they are the best way to go is to get customers to switch away from the category leader and ultimately try to pivot to one of the other strategies. So this is fine, right? But what's really interesting about this is that you cannot look at these strategies from an internal point of view and not consider the customer side of this, right? So there is the internal kind of storytelling side, and then there is the external part of storytelling. You need to engage customers so they go along with you on a journey, and they see themselves as heroes in a story. One, where they are pioneers. If you're trying to create a new category, these people need to feel as though they themselves are leading and creating the category with you. Or if you're the category leader and you want people to use your brand in novel or more valuable ways, you need them to see themselves there again as heroes in a story where they become the best versions of yourself in collaboration with your brand. Now, if you are trying to execute a brand commitment strategy where you have retained customers who are also using a competitor, you need to see them, you need to get them to see that you're working too hard. So a customer that, on a given evening is turning on Netflix and turning on Amazon Prime and turning on HBO and trying to figure out what to watch is wasting time. And we as humans are cognitive misers. This is another kind of psychological phenomenon that's well documented. We are always looking for shortcuts, and that's certainly going amongst different brands and trying to figure out which one to use on a given day is kind of wasteful. So cognitive miser. And then there's greener pastures. So if you're trying to get customers to switch brands as a way to establish a foothold in a category, you need to be able to show customers of the category leader that they're in kind of not the best relationships. They could do better if they left their partner and moved over to your side, to a greener pasture. So what's interesting to me is the mirror relationship between brand strategies and customer stories. You can't do one well. You can't create a fantastic strategy if you cannot engage customers, but also you can't be successful internally if you can't engage your internal audience as well. So let me just talk a bit more about these, right? So category development strategies where you need to engage customers as pioneers. You really want to be thinking of these two as parallels. And this type of strategy, of course, is industry sort of agnostic in the sense that we have companies that have executed category development strategies across many different industries. In medical devices, very well documented case of Intuitive Medical, which in the year 2000 launched the first robotic assisted surgery tool, the Da Vinci robot, still in the market today, very successful. And with it, they engaged people in new era of surgery. Tesla in 2006 launching the Tesla S. Yes, we had electric vehicles before Tesla was around, of course, but we didn't have luxury electric vehicles. Splenda in the 1990s convinced people that you could have no calories and a natural sweetener. Whether or not was true, we'll see. And then Peloton in 2014 launching a business model that enabled people to have immersive boutique fitness in the convenience of their homes. And in the year 2000, Barclays launching exchange-traded funds, an innovative type of a mutual fund that could be traded like a stock, new category. Cordis in 2003 launching drug-eluting stents, a 3x price to bare metal stent, incredibly successful for a little bit anyhow. And the other example I have here, GE Healthcare, who in the late 1990s launched an ultrasound that was the size of a phone. And it was actually launched to aid doctors in rural India, but then brought to developed markets and now used in outpatient settings all the time. Right, so what we find in this story archetype, the customers see themselves as pioneers, just as the brand is trying to attempt to create a new category. And yes, of course, you want to think about the customer journey here, but what you want to design is a brand experience that mirrors it step by step. So really important is that you segment customers initially and find people who are sort of at the fringes of existing categories. Yes, they're in a category, but they have some latent dissatisfaction. There's something they're missing in the category. And so you bring a breakthrough innovation to market. Really importantly, you give it a name that engages, that has a sense of novelty in it, but also familiarity. So robotic assisted surgery, you're like, oh, robots, this is really cool. Surgery, I know what that is. In the case of Intuitive Medical, they actually engage urology and gynecology surgeons who, a lot of them, the way that they were trained, were sort of being left out of minimally invasive techniques. They felt their outcomes just weren't very good. And robotics gave them a way to leapfrog into kind of the next era of surgery. So they discovered a way for them to imagine themselves heroes in a story that was just being written then. Um, and so, really important as a brand, because you're bringing something new to market, you need to increase the importance of the benefit of the innovation. In the case of robotic surgery, it was precision. So, precise surgery enables much better outcomes, less bleeding, etc. Now, thinking about getting those customers to not only engage but actually adopt the category, you want to think about sampling and getting them engaged with the brand for the first time as an opportunity to educate. So customer education is critical. You don't want people to have a terrible first experience with the innovation, and that's likely because it's something they've never seen or used before. Now, kind of the downside of this strategy is that if you want to be successful in developing a new category, you need to establish infrastructure that everybody else is going to benefit from. Now, in medical devices, of course, you need to develop clinical evidence, and you need to sell, like Intuitive did something nobody had ever done before. They were selling to hospital administrators, and they presented robotics as a way to change the reputation of a community hospital. They started actually partnering with those hospitals and doing actual viral marketing in local markets. Robotic surgery is developed one community hospital, one local market at a time. And then you want to be developing an ardent following. It's really critical that you work first with customers who bring credibility to your technology and are motivated enough to go out there. And as they tie their personal success to your new business model, they feel very motivated to share their learnings with others. And the brand here needs to provide a platform for them to do so. I want to just share one tool here that we use in big picture marketing. We call it the 6-box value proposition. And yes, there's lots of different value proposition formats, but what's great about this one is that it really ties the brand strategy to the customer story in a way that forces simplification. We have just these 6 boxes. You can't put a lot of text into them or you'll lose your audience. We start with the current behavior. So marketing, of course, is a behavioral discipline. So what is the one behavior you want to change? Now, for this particular strategy, the behavior that you identify is one outside the category. So our hospital performs lots of open surgery. These are people who are not in robotics. And the belief that drives them, but also an insight, a problem that the brand has discovered and is going to really mine. Here it is. We're doing fine. I wonder if we're keeping up. Robotics is intriguing, but is it worth it? Right? I've heard about this new technology, but man, it sounds really expensive and kind of a pain to adopt. And then what we want to see on the right side is the behavior that is going to enable our business goal. So we will adopt the Da Vinci robotic system. That's straightforward enough. And then the belief on the top right that is going to motivate customers to adopt that new behavior. Robotics pays for itself by improving our reputation and patient demand. And now in the middle, what makes this entire puzzle work needs to be a statement from the brand to that target audience that has the power to get them to want to engage in positive change and also change their beliefs. The Da Vinci surgical system enhances your hospital's reputation by bringing your institution into the next frontier of minimally invasive surgery. Notice that at a $2 million price point, Da Vinci needs to engage not only the urology surgeon, they need to engage the hospital administration. And for that reason, they develop a value proposition around reputation, not just the clinician, but the entire facility. And then how are we going to prove this, right? How are we going to scaffold this value proposition with really compelling reasons to believe? And in generating these reasons to believe, I'm not going to read them. You need, first of all, you need alignment to that one value proposition, And you need really to appeal to the different ways in which each of these stakeholders learn. So some of them are going to be more prone to wanting clinical data because they're clinicians and they're reasonable and rational. And others are going to need more kind of emotional appeals. And others yet are going to need economic proof, right? So you want to ensure you cover all that. So this is a great tool, and obviously really critical to then designing your execution. I'm going to take a look at the other three strategies. So brand expansion strategy, as I mentioned, this is a strategy that we use to engage customers in a story arc where they're the best versions of themselves, the story archetype. And examples here, Amazon, right? They came into the market selling books, and now we know that they measure their success by looking at what percent of our disposable income we're spending with them. Stryker, an incredible success story, a company that started making beds and stretchers and now basically builds entire ORs and is tremendously successful. They've quadrupled their share price in the last 10 years. Gillette, don't you want to be the best version of yourself? Well, that will require that every 3 to 5 years, you throw away a product that works just fine and you get another one that works just fine, but has more blades. And then Apple, of course, 1984, Big Brother is watching you. Big Brother is, of course, a PC, and Apple enables you to be a rebel, get the Macintosh, which was a computer for essentially nerds, but now is a brand that's cool. And they've gone from, of course, we know, computers to music to being the ecosystem that we use to run our lives. Dyson, 1992, they launched the Cyclone vacuum cleaner. And of course, they've gone from vacuums to all kinds of appliances that use air in some way, hair dryers, etc. And what's interesting about this brand is just how incredibly disciplined they've been in managing their value proposition. So every product under the brand has similar design, might be in different categories, might be selling to commercial customers, consumers, but they look the same warranties, etc. And that's what's really interesting. Volvo, right? So this brand, gone through lots of iterations in the mid 2000s, purchased by Ford, who did not really invest in it, and then eventually spun off to a Chinese conglomerate. And they got into SUVs in 2014 after decades of very little investment. And now they've really re-engaged with their customers who all see themselves as the safest drivers around. So the best version of yourself story, right, is the mirror of that is this brand expansion strategy. You really need to look at these side by side. We start here with a customer that is already in our brand community. And what we want to do is announce that we have an incremental innovation. We might do that, once a year in September, as Apple does, or we might just release an upgrade every once in a while when it's available, like Tesla does, right? The customer then discovers they could be doing more. They were fine before, but now, of course, they see themselves as maybe missing out on something. We show them that there's a new brand standard, there's a new sort of ideal within the brand, and they there as well imagine themselves living a better version of their lives. And so they become really motivated to try and expand use of their brand. Here, we want to be servicing the customer. We want to reinforce the choices that were already made. We want to use their data to show them how, by upgrading and growing with the brand, they are creating value for themselves. And then, of course, remind them at the end that they've made the right choice. They continue to make the right choice. And the more committed they are to the brand, the better off they are. And again, the idea is they become loyal and feel motivated to share their story. And then we talk about brand commitment strategies. In brand commitment strategies, as I mentioned before, we're engaging with people who are sort of working too hard. And people come to this place for one of two reasons. They believe that brands in a category pretty much are all the same. Like, what beer am I going to have today when I sit down at a restaurant? Well, what's available? Because they're all sort of the same. Or they might actually feel that brands are not the same, that they need to work extra hard to get what they want. So I'm going to use this brand this day and this brand that day because I need them all to get the best out of the business category. And This is a tough place for a brand to be in because you're competing in a relatively small competitive field. Energizer, Duracell, just really a duopoly. And these two brands spent 20, 30 years suing each other. Energizer had developed a bunny to prove that their batteries lasted longer, and the bunny was drumming and drumming and drumming. But unfortunately, Energizer was so busy with the bunny that they did not trademark that bunny. And so Duracell took the bunny to Europe, Duracell took the bunny to Canada, and then they started suing each other over who owned the bunny. Duracell eventually did win this war. They stopped talking about performance, and they talked about how their batteries were the ones that were chosen when there was a critical application needed. Visa, MasterCard, and American Express, most consumers carry not just one credit card, but three. So again, here you see three companies really entrenched in warfare. And what's important here is, again, is to kind of, yes, of course, consider that people need to switch away from the other brands in order to use you more, but try to not engage in a like war. And Visa did this perhaps by becoming the most ubiquitous of these three credit cards. Netflix, Amazon, Disney, streaming wars, right? So this is really a war around content and eyeballs. And by the end of 2021, at least, Netflix had 221 million viewers, perhaps being declared kind of the winner, temporarily at least, in this war. And then the war for your belly at breakfast time. What cereal you're going to have today? So people, again, don't wake up in the morning often with a single cereal in mind. They like variety. And Kellogg's then needs to develop variety within its portfolio to try to get a larger share of our stomachs. Interesting story here. CeraVe, Neutrogena. Neutrogena, by far the brand that was preferred by dermatologists for decades. But CeraVe, after being purchased by L'Oreal, really going after dermatologists. Dermatologists recommend two to three brands, and CeraVe convinced them that thanks to its formula that had ceramides, they provided a better skin barrier. And dermatologists initially bought this relative to moisturizers. CeraVe, not just happy with moisturizers, went after the sunscreen category, one where Neutrogena had really been very dominant for years. And there again, they gained considerable share. So what we see here in these types of strategies is a customer who is engaging with the brand. And again, as I mentioned, they're seeking variety by purchasing different brands. They feel like they have to do that. Or they might feel that there's just not a strong reason to commit to one brand. So basically, the way out of this for a brand is to improve convenience, to really be available everywhere, to make it super easy for the customer to think of that brand at the point of purchase and choose that brand, whether it's making a phone call to get a proposal from a consulting company, or walking into a stockroom and picking a medical device, or you improve variety to convince the customer that they're just working too hard and they could save their mental resource and perhaps some money as well by committing to a brand. Perhaps you could bundle, right? And you want to motivate them to become more committed. You, as I mentioned, want to make the brand ubiquitous. So place availability becomes really important, and convenience is important as well. And then you want to be rewarding their commitment. Amazon does that, I think, relatively well. If you commit to them and you sign up for their Prime program, you can get your stuff delivered the same day very often. As with the other strategies, you want to be taking a look at the customer experience. You want to aggregate metrics, and you want to be learning and iterating. Customers are looking at the other brands, but you want them to feel smarter when they commit to yours. All right, so the last strategy here is brand switching. And this strategy has a mirror image in this greener pastures customer archetype. So the idea of these strategies is a brand comes up with an innovation, but it's an innovation that they've actually been inspired to develop because some category has been formed and there's some success. So Hyundai, a Korean car company, comes into the US. They actually came in the late 1990s, where they were not very successful. They had some reliability issues, and they re-entered in 2003 with the Genesis. And the Genesis sort of establishes a foothold for this company in the US market. And then through the kind of the first decade of the 2000s and the financial recession, Hyundai doubles down on reliability by offering a 100,000-mile warranty for this car and free maintenance. And what they start seeing is lots of people switching away from Japanese brands to Hyundai. And it's interesting because Hyundai, of course, has relaunched the Genesis as a premium brand. Gmail versus Outlook. Outlook ran a pretty famous campaign a few years back where they were trying to convince all of us that Gmail was stealing our data and we should switch to Outlook, which respected our privacy. Samsung versus Apple. Samsung has time and time again come to iPhone customers and told them that iPhones are just not very advanced and they should move to Samsung, which has the latest performance features. Vizio versus Sony. Vizio is a company that manufactures TVs, and they've gone into a single distribution channel in Costco. And what they do is they sell televisions that have the same features as a comparable Sony, but for the price of a Sony, you can get a slightly larger screen. Very successful. And then a medical device example here, Applied Medical, a Chinese company, which launches an advanced bipolar technology that competes successfully in some markets and for some customers with Medtronic's LigaSure technology. And so what you see in here is an innovation that motivates customers of a category leader to consider whether they could be better off and really not lose that much by trying something new. And so the key in these stories is that you approach a relationship that at least externally looks fine, but you start mining it for dissatisfaction, and you present your brand as an alternative. So you want to show people that they've settled. They're with the wrong partner. And over time, you mine that relationship until they become unhappy enough to want to switch. So they compare alternatives. This may take a while depending on the type of loyalty that customer had with the prior brand. You sell the relative advantage. So in all other ways, a Samsung is just like an iPhone, except in one really important way, right? And so you get people to want to try the brand. Eventually they jump ship. You want to ensure that that transition is easy. Samsung does something interesting. They actually have an app that you can download from their website so that all of your data seamlessly transfers over to your new device. And as customers come into the new brand, you want to ensure that you've developed an experience for them where they find a lot of familiarity, even as they're coming into a totally different, company. So they confirm to themselves they're really not giving anything up by abandoning that relationship, and you really want them to never look back. So they're welcomed by your new brand community. You engage them, you create that sense of togetherness, and they're happy forever after with you. So the idea, of course, is that we think about brand strategies as stories. We know stories follow a particular arc. Once upon a time, a character realizes they have a problem. Again, no great stories about people who are super happy and then something amazing happens to them. So they have a problem. They meet the brand. The brand there is the guide. And the brand guides them to action in a humble way. And the customers see themselves achieving success or avoiding failure, collaborating with the brand. Think about the tools that you have as a marketer to tell this story. And yes, of course, you want to tell this story to your external audience, but just as importantly, you need to be engaging your internal audience. You're not going to become a great marketer by just talking marketing lingo to other marketers. And the tools that we have here, customer journey mapping, persona descriptions, the 6 value proposition tool, etc. These are storytelling tools. So use them with that in mind. I wanted to just leave us with a couple of thoughts, right? We are trying to create brands that are really valuable. So brands are strategic assets of our organizations. But great brands and companies that have valuable brands are companies that are admired. You can't really create a great brand that's sustainable if your internal culture is impoverished. So think about what makes for a great brand. It's a company that guides its marketing from a place of strength, from what we call the core competence. And then think about the customer journey. We want to be engaging customers. We want to persuade them. We want to motivate them. We want to make our work memorable, our brand top of mind. But we can only do that when we design brand experiences that engage internal audiences and engage similarly external audiences. So the brand story and the brand strategy, they are really one and the same. So now I'm going to open it up for questions. So see some familiar names. Any questions? So there, Boone and Fred and Ernst and Giovanna, been a long time. Agnes, and Jose Maria. Nice to see you guys here. All right, I think this presentation hasn't really. What is the new trend or tool to build loyalty? Okay, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I mean, I think loyalty is really built from a place of integrity in the brand. So people talk about lots of ideas here, right? Brand tribes, CRM tools. So you can think about both the management idea of the day. You can think about the software tool of the day. But you really want to be thinking about why would anybody want to work with our brand? How do we engage our customers? How do we segment people that want what we have to sell? And to me, it's the way to get to loyalty is to lead with great integrity. All right, and yes, there will be a replay of this session available on LinkedIn. So Fred has a question. I'm curious how long it would take an organization to realistically move the ship in this direction if they don't already have such a program in place. I can, I guess, refer to the experience of companies like Stryker or J&J, but I would say, Stryker and companies like Stryker, they really think of this journey as a process, and it's a process that requires that the leadership team is really engaged. We start working with organizations sometimes with a VP of marketing or a sales leader, but ultimately we are successful if management starts really buying into the marketing agenda. And the idea is not really to invest in marketing, but rather to develop a vocabulary that everyone in the organization can use to discuss marketing issues. And then it's really all about embedding these tools into the behaviors that rising leaders have to demonstrate, right? So, how are people launching their products? How are people engaging with external agencies? How are people conducting research? And there's so much waste in the research companies do because they've not really iterated through these questions in a way that has enabled them to refine the key questions they need to ask. How do you make sure your customer story is not too cookie cutter with the brand being the hero solving the customer's problem? Great question, right? So these four types of strategies and these four customer story archetypes are just broad categories. The details of this really come from the particulars of the very specific category that you're in, the very specifics of your company. Um, and again, I go back to what I said before, coming at this from a place of integrity, getting people to buy into the values of your organization. I've been in companies where the values, are posted all over the hallways, and people just really don't buy into them. They just feel like they're completely hypocritical. And I've been in companies where leadership lives those values, and they lead with honesty, and the difference is just tremendous. All right. Well, I wanted to thank everyone for being here today. It's been fantastic to share this time with you. I know it's almost the 4th of July in the United States. So for those of you who are looking to enjoy some time outside, I think it's time to take a shorter Friday. And as mentioned, this will absolutely be available for replay. All right. Thank you, everyone.